We already thought we had enough big stories to cover this off season with NIL and a 12-team college football playoff proposal. That is more than a full off season, especially once you tack on the transfer portal and then a dead period that moved recruiting into the month of June. So much to talk about concerning college football in the off season, more so than any college football season in memory. And now this. Texas and Oklahoma, probably to the SEC. Obviously, a lot of red tape and a lot of things have to happen. We got Andrew Hattersley on the line from Gig'em 247 Sports, joins us on a regular basis to break down Texas A&M recruiting and personnel on the field, which I point you to, everyone. Our recent offensive and defensive breakdowns, courtesy Andrew, did a great job to help us break down the Aggies as they get set for Kent State in about 6 weeks. Andrew, how are we doing today?
I thought we were supposed to be a little quieter in July. You know, obviously when we knew Jimbo Fisher and the Aggies were going to the podium yesterday, so we figured it was going to pick up, you know, in terms of busyness. But yeah, it kind of came across fast, and you know, right before Jimbo Fisher and the rest of the A&M players were going to go up on the podium, it probably came out 15 minutes before, and you know, Brent Zwerneman's a really good reporter, so. You know, great job to him on that story.
Well, yeah, the SEC is king of the media days for sure, but we also have the ACC and the Big Ten going on today. And typically we would be like, you know, squeezing blood from a stone basically to try to get storylines and interesting topics out of these conversations. But that's almost been dismissed that it's media days going on right now in light of this story. Texas and Oklahoma. I don't know that there are two bigger fish unless you would go to Notre Dame or Ohio State in college football that the SEC could acquire. I'm certainly going to measure my words here because by all reports, it's been confirmed to a certain extent that Oklahoma and Texas reached out to the SEC. It's not the SEC pursuing those two schools, but Oklahoma and Texas maybe not necessarily being happy with their stance right now in the Big 12, reaching out to the SEC. So just when you heard the news, your initial thoughts and feelings.
Well, it would obviously be huge from just a recruiting standpoint and how much those schools already battle. And one of the things that A&M likes so much about being in the SEC, and you heard Ross Bjork kind of mention it over and over again yesterday, was, you know, the advantage of being the only school in Texas in the SEC and how they were able to sell that from a recruiting standpoint. And the other part was just how these divisions would shake out down the road. How, you know, whether if it were to end up happening, you know, you would have Texas, Oklahoma, A&M, and LSU all kind of, you know, in one region. And then, you know, on the eastern side, you could have Alabama and Georgia and Florida and Auburn on another side. However the divisions would shake out, I mean, that's just an incredibly loaded and competitive conference. But, you know, I think one of the things is you mentioned NIL and the transfer portal. College football is changing so much right now that every school is kind of jockeying to get into position on where they need to be. And so those were kind of my first thoughts, was every school's trying to position itself, and the game is changing so much right now.
Absolutely. We got Andrew Hattersley on the line from Gig'em 247. Please join his work over there as he does an outstanding job covering Texas A&M football. We've had him on to break down the offense and the defense. Of course, the Aggies looking for a big season here in 2021. It kicks off against Kent State, but they may soon be joined. And when we say soon, you get the lawyers involved and contracts and everything else. Like, this isn't going to be next football season. I can't imagine. This is a more 3 or 4 years down the road if it transpires and is being communicated. Obviously, if you do the math with 75% of the vote needed in the SEC, you're talking about 11 schools of 14 that need to approve.
Yeah, and the interesting part to that is if it does end up happening is when, because if you're trying to recruit right now and you're kind of in you're kind of in an interesting spot where you're recruiting on something that you might be doing in 2025. It's an interesting message on how you sell recruits for 2022, 2023, and 2024. yeah, the timeline is very much up in the air, and it's going to certainly make Texas such a huge battleground state if you have three schools in the region, and if at this point they almost have to hope it goes through, because trying to basically jump to the SEC. I mean, you're giving your comment on what you think about the Big 12, and clearly not as big as strong a conference, and so you can't really sell that anymore as being on the level of the SEC if you're trying to get out of the conference yourself. So that's one thing, and just in terms of these 2022 prospects, it's going to be really fascinating to start talking to them. The more that I think they're learning about this too, and trying to wrap their heads around it, and so getting their perspective on, okay, so this could be something that happens when you're a junior or senior. How does that affect your mindset? Is going to be something over the next 3 weeks to a month or 2 weeks, whenever we get the chance to start getting around them again, and just getting their perspective on how this changes things will be really one of the big storylines to follow heading into September and August.
Folks, if you're looking for some information and analysis that you may not get here, because we've got Andrew on for a particular reason concerning all this, we just concluded a live stream on the main channel. Just go to markrogerstv.com or just look up Voice of College Football right here on YouTube. We just talked about, obviously, what Oklahoma and Texas bring to the SEC, what those SEC member schools may be voting based on their relationships with Oklahoma and Texas and their interests. What happens to the Big 12 now that it's basically the Big 8 without its two big fish? Where do they go for teams? Does it collapse? What does the Big 10 do to counter, because it's the other big player in this in regards to maintaining the eyeballs on the TV sets and the popularity and the ratings and the money? The Pac-12 has obviously been involved in expansion in the last 10 years as well. Do some of those Big 12 teams look toward the West Coast? And so we discussed all that, the geography, the money involved, the school status that various conferences hold to a degree in regards to membership in that conference, all those things we discussed there. But Andrew's expertise beyond the personnel for Texas A&M football is the recruiting aspect. And so, Andrew, let's back up a couple steps, and let me ask you this. Where we stand right now, regardless of whether this goes through or not, in terms of the state of Texas, because it's arguably the best state in the nation. I don't think there's any question. It's Texas, Florida, when it comes to the best and the highest volume of high school football talent. Texas, under Tom Herman, was bringing in top 5 to 10 classes, but there's been much criticism over them losing a lot of big names to Texas A&M. Of course, Kevin Sumlin did a nice job, but Jimbo Fisher's amped it up considerably. Then you've got schools like Ohio State jumping into Texas and pulling out some of the best recruits. So where do you stack up Texas A&M right now in terms of keeping those best players at home?
Yeah, and the other one I would throw in there that, well, of course, Alabama's one that we'd have to throw in as well. And then, you're starting to see Oregon be more and more a factor in the state. I mean, just looking at one of the key targets, we talked about Calvin Banks a couple of weeks ago. One of the key targets remaining on the board is Harold Perkins, and he has an official visit scheduled to Oregon as well. So you just see Oregon start to become more of a factor. Look, this is going to be fascinating to figure out. I mean, for both programs, with the emergence of NIL and the emergence of how easy it is to travel, simply both programs have to win. Because if you don't win, and you've got kids that now see they can go out of state and have the opportunity to go to an Ohio State or go to another school and have the chance to compete for a college football playoff. Now, if playoff expansion ends up happening as well, that could be something that works in the favor of Texas and A&M if they're able to sell. We're getting into the playoff every single year, but right now they're having to fight as hard as ever to keep players in state because there's just so many players. LSU's done a good job of coming in, into the Houston area and being able to recruit that area as well. So it's one of those things that, right now I think Texas and Texas A&M are trying to fight to kind of hold ground and claim the state. And, it's not just them. It's, It's Florida as well, and the Florida, Miami, and Florida State are trying to do the same thing with schools like Alabama coming in, and they're trying to lock down the state's top talent there as well.
Obviously, the SEC has historically had a certain footprint, and it's the Deep South. Well, in 1992, it expanded a little bit to the East Coast, a little more with South Carolina, and even more so brought in Arkansas, which was a major player in the Southwest Conference when that conference dissolved. And then 10 years ago, first football season, 2012, Texas A&M comes in, which was an enormous benefit to both. I think that there's no question that that's been a overriding success on both fronts. It's allowed the SEC, and to your last point, maybe given Alabama and LSU and others an even stronger foothold in the state of Texas. And it's been, of course, enormous for Texas A&M, even though the competition's better for them to make money, and just the national brand of Texas A&M has just shot through the roof since they've been in the SEC.
Yeah.
Missouri's an interesting place in all this because they are geographically the biggest outlier in the SEC, but I would think that they would have that cachet of being able to go into homes in Texas and Oklahoma and in their region and say, we play in the SEC. And actually, we're pretty competitive. We're not getting beaten up. We're pretty good. We usually win our 6 to 8 games a year, and that Missouri is a player in this.
They are, and I was just having this conversation with somebody last night. You weren't listening in on my conversation. We were talking.
I promise I wasn't.
We were talking about this exact same thing. That for a school like Missouri, one of the things they've always done so successfully is being able to come in and pick off players in Texas that maybe weren't prioritized by Texas or A&M, and they're starting to do it again in this cycle. They just landed a kid out of Texas that I'm a big fan of, Tavoris Jones. That was a couple of weeks ago, and so you're seeing them be able to start, kind of making inroads in the state of Texas again, and they've got other players in Texas they're very much in on, and so for them, it's one of those interesting things because you hear some people say that they wouldn't be in favor of this move. But to your point, it gives them the recruiting angle of being able to sell not 1, but 2 games in Texas and possibly playing in Oklahoma. And, that's not a bad drive for family to be able to make if you're in Texas. And so you're really now selling the opportunity to be able to potentially have 3 games around in the state of Texas or around the state of Texas. And, that's going to be something that might help them recruiting wise. And for Arkansas, the other thing to remember is in 2024, the game at Jerry World between Arkansas and A&M is going to go back to probably being on campus. And so if you're an Arkansas, fan and coach there, you're looking at the opportunity to add a school like Texas and guarantee that you can play in the state of Texas once per year, because they were going to lose that opportunity if it went back to home and away between Arkansas and A&M. So for them, there's some benefits as well, but it's going to make the state a lot more competitive. But I could definitely see a situation where Missouri and Arkansas are a lot more active in the state as well.
And for Texas and Oklahoma, they have so many pluses already.
Yeah.
The one negative on the recruiting path, I would think, would be and I'm talking like high level premium players, because of course the Big 12, for all the criticism out there about not playing defense, and they have taken a hit in the NFL draft in recent years, still obviously loaded with talent, with really good players. But if you're the type player that can go anywhere and you're being recruited by Texas and Oklahoma, of course you listen and you may go there. But the one critical knock on them is, okay, you play in a league that's somewhat disregarded. You play 1 or 2 big games a year versus the SEC. Every game, every week, it just has so much attention that you would think that this would be the missing piece for Texas in particular, to say, we're not only Texas, we're now in the SEC.
Yeah, so for me, it's it's a little bit of Oklahoma. Like I think Oklahoma sneakily benefits from this as well because I think there's a couple things holding back Texas. Whereas with Oklahoma, I think they've been in the college football playoff the last couple of years, or right on the doorstep. Um, and so with them, winning hasn't been a problem. And so when now they're able to sell the SEC angle and the SEC aspect, I think that gives them a huge, huge boost. For Texas, I still think it comes down to, performance on the field. They're going to have to win more consistently. They're going to have to show stability at the with their coaching staff, which they haven't necessarily done over the last decade to 15 years. And so I think this somewhat benefits Oklahoma more. Funny enough, when I think the focus so much has been on Texas and Texas A&M, where I think Oklahoma sneakily benefits from this because they've been able to win on a consistent basis, and both are going to go up against a higher level of competition, and there's going to be some challenges though when they do get in the league, because one of the things A&M's done a great job of is they've built in the trenches on the defensive line and offensive line. And so if you're Oklahoma and Texas, that's going to be an area that you're going to have to address because it's such a key part in the SEC when you look at some of the opponents you have to play. I think that's going to be the biggest thing.
Because, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we saw Texas A&M have to make that transition when they entered the SEC, where
and it's still
athletically they were still really good. That wasn't the problem. It was more they got beat up a little bit, especially on defense.
Yeah, I think, and that process still continues, right? Like they're still, if you look at their defensive line board for this cycle, I mean, they've got still 8 to 10 guys that could potentially end up in the class, and they're trying to find 5 to 6 guys a year right now to still beef up the line of scrimmage, and it's been a huge, huge, huge priority for Jimbo Fisher and the staff, and offensive line too. I think he mentioned one of the things. Funny enough, it kind of slid under the radar because of just the talk yesterday was Oklahoma and Texas, obviously. The way he talked about the offensive line, and he said, yes, they're having to replace 4 starters, but the talent level and the way they've upgraded the past couple of years has gone to another level. And so that's why he feels so confident about his team is, I think he made it a point to upgrade the line of scrimmage. And I think he finally feels like heading into year 4, they're actually doing that rather, but it took some time. It took them getting beaten up. I mean, my goodness, 2 years ago when they had to play, Clemson, Alabama, Georgia, and LSU, they got beat up on the line of scrimmage, and they were actually serious concerns about the offensive line and what direction the offensive line was heading, because I just don't quite think they were there yet. And now 2 years later, I think they're starting to get into that direction. But that'll be one of the biggest things when you look at Texas and Oklahoma. If it becomes official that they're going to have to beef up the line of scrimmage, because that's such a huge part in the SEC.
Now, I got to think that most college football fans that are within the SEC footprint and root for SEC teams or root for Texas and Oklahoma, that the majority of them are in favor of this. I got to think, just from the standpoint of, man, this conference is going to be ridiculously good. But anybody outside of the conference footprint or these 2 particular teams are going to feel the exact opposite. I'm just curious to know how this strikes you, because I'll let you know I don't like it.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why, is because I think it's going to hurt the sport competitively, because again, right now the Big Ten is the second best conference, but there's a gap between the SEC and the Big Ten. I don't think anybody would argue that. And maybe some people would argue that the Big Ten's not the second best conference. It's not the second best for sure, but I think most people believe it is. Yeah. From other standpoints, off the field, money, again, TV ratings, popularity, it's quite a war going on between the SEC and the Big Ten if you look at the numbers. And just to outline why Oklahoma and Texas would do this, besides the obvious, the last report I saw is that SEC schools and Big Ten schools were taking home around $65 to $68 million per school for football.
Yeah.
And then that drops to like the mid 30s for everybody else, for the Pac-12, for the ACC, for the Big 12. Like there's that much of a gap between those two and everybody else. Well, the competitive balance on the field, you draw in Oklahoma and Texas already to the best conference. And then I don't know how the other conferences can possibly, there's going to be such a hyper focus on the SEC
Yeah.
versus the rest of college football. I don't know that that's going to be healthy.
Yeah, it's going to be one of the big things to watch because, the Oklahoma and Texas had really carried the Big 12 as of late, especially on the football side. And so, you look at a school like Iowa State, who was just starting to come into their own on the football side. What happens to them now going forward? You've got some schools in the AAC like the SMUs, the Houstons, the Memphis, USF, UCF that are all going to try to push forward and try to get into a bigger conference. But you're right. I mean, there's going to be a clear gap between kind of the SEC and the Big Ten, and the big thing that what's going to be fascinating to watch is just with the 12-team playoff, how does that shake out? I mean, are you going to have 4 or 5 teams from the SEC that are going to be in the college football playoff?
I think you are
every single year, and then how does that work for everybody else? I mean, is it going to just how are they going to divide up the divisions? How are they going to judge those 4 to 5 teams every single year? And it really puts the other schools in a tough spot, whether you're the Pac-12. I mean, you've got to respond to this by doing something and keep pace. The Big 12's in total flux. They're just going to be kind of in scramble mode. And, I think this forces the ACC to kind of look to, are there any teams that we pluck from the Big 12 and try to add, and kind of same for the Big 10. I mean, they could potentially look to kind of close that gap. But to your point earlier, there's nobody on the magnitude of a Texas, Oklahoma out there, unless the ACC tries to pull in Notre Dame as a full-time school. But who knows where that goes?
Outside the SEC, Ohio State's obviously the most dominant program, especially if you include tradition and history. If you don't, then Clemson's right there too.
Yeah.
You're a recruiting guy. Obviously, you're focused in the SEC and on Texas A&M. But if you look at it, and I know nobody's crying about Ohio State, like they're the last, practically the last program in the nation that anybody's going to cry over. But at the same time, do you think that could hurt their recruiting? Because sure, they're still who they are, but they're kind of isolated from where it's all happening.
Yeah, I think it could, because I mean, there's no doubt that I still think under Jimbo Fisher, A&M's recruiting is going to be fine. I don't think there's going to be any concerns. I mean, he recruits at such an elite level, and he did in a very crowded space in Florida too. When you look at the boost that Texas and Oklahoma's recruiting is probably going to get as well, it's going to make it a lot harder for Ohio State to come in and try to, pull some of the top players in the state as they might have done in the past, because it's going to be more spread out between Texas A&M, Oklahoma, and Texas. I still think Ohio State's going to get their players because they recruit on such an elite level. But it is going to make it more difficult for them, and I think that's one of the things that, when you're Texas and Oklahoma, I think you're looking at a school like Ohio State. Okay, how do we keep them out of the state? What do we need to still do? And one of those is being able to sell the SEC and being able to sell playing in the best conference, which we just talked about the gap that there is between the SEC and the Big Ten. They're going to be able to now take it. They would be able to take advantage and sell that same sort of recruiting edge that they get to play in the best conference and all that. And so you wonder what that does to a school like Ohio State's recruiting, or, what a school like Oregon is going to be able to do, and if they can continue coming into the state to pull off some of the best players.
Interesting discussion on recruiting as it pertains to this possible Texas-Oklahoma move to the SEC. And obviously, much has to be worked out, and it's not going to take place if it does. And it seems like it's got legs, that's for sure, if people are acknowledging it. Nobody denied it. When Texas and Oklahoma, Had it been a bogus story, as it has been in the past, they would have denied it, but they didn't.
And the other fascinating part too is, just from a recruiting standpoint, is we're coming up on that kind of week that we talked about last time, that the dead period is going to be lifted. So beginning on Saturday, kids are going to be able to go on visits for about a week. So how these schools kind of sell this for the next week is going to be fascinating, because Oklahoma and Texas are probably going to be in limbo for that week, and maybe they'll have an idea of what they're doing. But this week that the dead period is going to be lifted is going to be fascinating.
Good stuff from Andrew Hattersley. Joins us on a regular basis to talk Texas A&M football. Gig'em 247 Sports. You know the name brand, so you know that they do quality work there. Andrew, appreciate you stopping by as always.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
All right, Will, how you doing today?
Doing good. Kind of taking in the last, what are we at now? The last 24 hours, roughly, I guess. Or can't complain. What a wild way to wrap up SEC media days and move into the weekend, and then get ready for the start of fall camp.
Let me do the proper introduction here. Will Gunter from the all-new early game, 107.5 The Game. We'll get his banner up here in just a second. Again, Will has joined us for a long, long time to talk the SEC and college football in general. So this is an off-season, Will, where we already had a full off-season of storylines: a 12-team college football playoff proposal, NIL. Those are the two major ones. But even with the transfer portal and recruiting being altered by this pandemic and dead period and just craziness all over the place, and then the sledgehammer came down last night with Oklahoma and Texas to the SEC. What was your initial thought?
When it was a busy day yesterday, and so when I saw it, I kind of wrote it off as being something that was a non-story, just kind of an internet fodder type thing. And as I started to pay attention to it and see that it had legs and that people were talking about it, and then just as crazy, seeing responses to it by Texas, by Oklahoma, by Oklahoma State, by Texas A&M, and then by Greg Sankey. That tells me that there's some validity to this, that something's going on. And I normally, I don't think you see Texas A&M or Oklahoma State, I don't want to say be worried about Oklahoma or Texas, but if it was a situation that you actually had something going on here, and they felt the need to speak up. Obviously, Texas A&M mentioning that they want to be the only school in the SEC from Texas. Oklahoma State talking about loyalty, and even Greg Sankey not really putting any of this to bed, which he could have done. So I thought all of that was extremely interesting.
I, like you, I was busy and I couldn't address it right out of the gate. And I had a couple people text me, and I saw something else online about Oklahoma to Texas to the SEC. And my initial thought was, okay, we've heard this and hear it every few years, Texas to the SEC. Okay. But obviously with the lack of denials, that was the first indicator that, okay. And then with Texas A&M speaking out about it as well, that again was a huge indicator. So obviously this is in motion, and it's going to come down to a large degree, this vote where we need 11 of 14 SEC schools. I think it's easy to determine which schools would have a voting interest against this move, but maybe their arms can be twisted by money and other considerations to get this to move through.
Well, what I'm kind of interested to see here is how much did these schools, or how much has been known about this previously? How much were the athletic directors aware of this? Because there's a part of me that sees this as a move by the SEC to add Oklahoma and Texas. And if that's the case, it looks like on the surface, it looks like Greg Sankey was working behind the scenes without consulting with the other schools involved. Now I find that hard to believe. So, is that true? Probably not. But that does raise one question. How much do the other 14 schools know? The other part of that is if that's the case, you feel like Greg Sankey is going to tell at least the other 12, this is how you're voting. This is not. I realize it's a free country and you're allowed to vote how you want, but you're not going to do that in this case. You're going to back me on this one. And he may look at Texas A&M and Missouri and say, hey, look, I realize I get the reasons you don't want these two teams in the conference, but I'm sorry. What's good for us is what's going to happen, and this is good financially for the SEC and for the new world of college football that we appear to be heading.
Right now, nobody can compete with the SEC on the field. I think we would both agree, and most people in college football would agree, that the Big Ten is the second best conference on the field. Some people may. I don't think it's decided, but it's pretty well thought in that direction. But that the SEC is the best, the Big Ten's second, but there's a gap. Now, in terms of off the field considerations, meaning money, popularity, TV ratings, it's really close. Those two conferences are bringing in, the last numbers I saw, like $65 to $68 million per team in football. And then it plummets after that. We're talking like low to mid 30s for Big 12, ACC, Pac 12. This then gives the SEC just a ridiculous advantage because there are no other Oklahomas or Texases for the Big Ten or anybody else to go out and get. They don't exist. So do you think that this is, I know for people inside the SEC and for Texas and Oklahoma, this has to be exciting, but do you think it's really healthy overall for the sport?
Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to view healthy for the sport. And, would it be better maybe if Oklahoma and Texas went to say, the ACC and helped that conference, gave them a few more national brand names? Yeah, maybe that's better for the sport as a whole. This isn't a situation where I think the conferences are looking out for the sport as a whole. They're looking out for, this is a Game of Thrones situation. I mean, that's what it is. It's Game of Thrones. And who can we align with? We did the morning show here in Columbia. South Carolina fans are not particularly thrilled about the thought of adding Texas or Oklahoma to the conference, despite the fact that I don't think that means South Carolina play. South Carolina might not play one of them except for every 9 years, the way they have the schedule set up at times. So who knows if you're really making it that much more difficult on your regular season schedule. Maybe they go to some kind of weird formula. Maybe it does. Maybe Alabama and Auburn jump over to the east. So there's a lot of ifs, ands, and buts that we have to work through on that. But this is the SEC going, hey, we are the leader of college football. There's nobody else out there that is interested in changing conferences that we can get.
Hey, Will, unfortunately, we can't hear you now. It was starting to crackle for a while there. Can you hear me, Will?
You're cracking up a little bit. I don't know if you can hear me.
Okay. You were crackling for a while. We let it go, and then we lost you for about 30 seconds there, and now you're back. But it's still pretty rough.
Yeah, we might be better soon. I've had a computer issue that I was up. Apparently, a computer went down that I was about to use here. So if you're around, if we can text back and forth, we might be able to make this work here in just a little while. I've got a crashed computer that was the plan to use today. All
right. You do what you need to do. For me and otherwise, whatever you need to do. And we'll keep this link alive for a little while. So if you can jump on back anytime soon, that just use this link. If not, yeah, we'll connect later. Thanks, Will. Appreciate it, man. All right. There you have it. Will Gunter, 107.5 The Game. Unfortunately, couldn't keep Will on the line because of some technical issues. Now with Andrew Hattersley from Gig'em 247, hope you caught that portion of the conversation because Andrew, of course, took on the recruiting angle and what this means for Texas, Oklahoma, and then schools like Arkansas and Missouri, and then for schools that are trying to compete outside the SEC on a national level. My bottom line thought is that, again, and we discussed this for about 2 hours earlier on our main channel. So check out that conversation, a really good one with Jason Ray and Tony Siracusa from Last Word on College Football. One of the selling points to college football, in addition to the product on the field, which is amazing, which is exciting, is the fabric of the culture the traditions, the brands, the environments, all of that. And there's a unique flavor, there's a unique characteristic, um, a unique environment, feel, allegiance to the SEC, to the Big Ten, to the Big 12, to the Pac 12, to the ACC. They're all different. One of the major reasons why they're different is because they come from different parts of the country. They're woven and they are rooted in different cultures, different regions, different parts of the country that have different likes and dislikes and interests, styles of food, styles of music, styles of everything. Well, we're losing all that. We're losing the identity of the conferences. Just like we've lost the identity of the bowl games that were tied to those conferences, we are losing the identity of the sport through the conferences, because Nebraska in middle America now is connected to Rutgers, just outside of New York City, more than half the country away. That the Big 12, which is in basically Dust Bowl, Plains, Midwest territory, is connecting itself to West Virginia. There's not a state connected to West Virginia that's connected to another state to another state. It's about 7 degrees of separation to get from Big 12 territory to West Virginia. They don't belong. The Pac-12 has been the most consistent to its roots and its base on the West Coast, just going out as far as Colorado and Utah for 2 additional schools. The Big 12, again, besides West Virginia, has been pretty true to its place. But the SEC now venturing out to Missouri and now Oklahoma. And now that we've got a 16-team SEC, which it appears as though this is going to take place, 16 teams in the SEC. So the other conferences can't. So the Big 12, we'll call it the Big 8, to line up with the number of teams in the conference, can't survive. They will need to add schools just to have a conference of any magnitude, to have a American conference or a Conference USA caliber conference. They will have to maybe add Houston or BYU. That's unlikely. Memphis, somebody, 2 teams preferably, to get them back up to 10 to just maintain athletic competition, football competition. Okay, the Big Ten has greater aspirations than that, than just to survive. So for the Big Ten, it means we want to compete with the SEC. Well, there are no other schools for the Big Ten to pursue outside of maybe Cincinnati, maybe West Virginia, Iowa State. They would be the 3 that come to mind from a football standpoint that would be the best gets for the Big Ten. Of course, Notre Dame, but Notre Dame would have to turn over its entire athletic program allegiance from the Big Ten or from the ACC to the Big Ten. So most likely the ACC has a wild card in Notre Dame, that if Notre Dame and all this is, I don't think they're going to be technically forced, but possibly pressured, pushed into joining a conference, they already have their attachment to the ACC. So people that love the Big Ten and root for the Big Ten and want Notre Dame to join the Big Ten, and I believe that Notre Dame is the best football fit in the Big Ten. I don't think that's really debatable for all the reasons I just cited in terms of geography and culture and brand and tradition and history. Notre Dame's right in the middle of Big Ten territory, but that's not going to happen. So the ACC's got a wild card in Notre Dame where they could somewhat keep up with the SEC if they could add, let's say, UCF and Notre Dame, or Notre Dame and West Virginia. But for the Big Ten, it looks like the 3 possible additions that would mean something on the football field would be West Virginia, Iowa State, and Cincinnati. Outside of them, maybe they go all the way down to Texas and try to pluck TCU and go to Oklahoma State as well. Those teams are going to be scurrying those schools to stay relevant in football, and they're going to look to the Big Ten and the Pac-12. All right. As we noted earlier, and again, if you want more analysis on this, it was a really great discussion we had with Jason Ray and Tony Siracusa on the main channel earlier today. Check that out. These are the pods that are being submitted and proposed by the SEC network. They look like this. Unfortunately, I don't have that graphic that I used. Unfortunately, I used this graphic in the other stream, but it's not there now. So I'll have to read them off. So the SEC could take these 16 teams and they could divide them into 2 8-team divisions. Just add a team to each division, or completely revamp, because Texas and Oklahoma both come from the West, completely revamp the 2 divisions and build them over with 8 teams. Or, as the SEC network showed us today, go to a pod format, which is going to be completely confusing and difficult for the average sports fan, not because of their lack of intelligence, but their lack of interest. They're not college football every day, 24/7 thinking to try to comprehend and remember that the SEC is proposing Pod A, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, South Carolina; Pod B, Alabama, Auburn, Tennessee, Vanderbilt; Pod C, LSU, Texas A&M, Mississippi State, Ole Miss; Pod D, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Arkansas. And then it gets confusing as to what that even means, those 4 pods. What if you win your pod? Does that matter? Do you play in some kind of semifinal for the conference championship? Strange. I do not believe this is good for college football. All right, SEC dog. Do I see the Big 12 dissolving? And another question is, why do Texas and Oklahoma want out? What's going on there is what I'm asking. Okay. So number one, with the Big 12. Yes, the Big 12 is going to be at 8 teams. So that all depends on whether they can lure away. I would think that their targets would be within the region: Houston and Memphis, maybe Tulsa, Houston, Memphis, UCF. And if they can pull that off, if they can get at least 2 teams back, then they're going to survive. I think if they get 2 football playing schools back, let's say it's Houston and Memphis, then they survive. But the Big 12 minus Texas and Oklahoma and adding Memphis and Houston is not the same conference. So it's no longer going to be considered one of the 5. So that's going to be key in it dissolve. If they can't maintain at least 10 teams, then and if it teeters, it's going to be so close in regards to whether the conference can maintain its position or not. Things tend to either strengthen or unravel in this way. If somebody makes a move to another conference, if Iowa State says, well, this isn't looking good, and the Big Ten offers, and Iowa State goes to the Big Ten, then because of that move, then Oklahoma State, Kansas State, those schools might get scared and jump to the Pac-12 or jump to the Big Ten, and it'll just come crashing down. It's teetering. So it's very tenuous. And if a key player or 2 jump, then it's going to collapse. If they solidify by getting a Memphis and or a Houston and or a UCF before they have C schools defect, then they solidify it before they fall apart. Okay? So they're either going to go get the 2 ads to solidify the conference, and then that will probably keep the other schools, but if the other schools don't see a move being made or aren't impressed enough with the moves that are being made and are not impressed and sold on Memphis and Houston and UCF or whoever else, and they jump, then it's just all going to cave in because everybody's going to scatter, because you don't want to be one of the last three sitting there. So they're all going to run. They're all going to latch on to whatever they can get. And those two directions are going to be the Big Ten and the Pac-12. What's going on here in terms of the money? So the money is one draw. The one draw is money, obviously, because each school in the SEC brings home about twice as much money in football than any team in the Big 12. And then on top of that, you also have a situation where Oklahoma has not likened its position in the Big 12. Texas doesn't like its position in the Big 12, and there have been a lot of situations and decisions that have been made that neither those schools like, and Texas has been treated in such a way that caused Nebraska partially it to be part of their decision to leave for the Big Ten a few years ago. I believe we got Will back.
It turns out you just have to uninstall Foxfire and reinstall it. Good times. So there we go.
Reboot.
So shouldn't have any problem hearing me now.
Cool. Yeah, you sound good. You sound good. So I don't know exactly where we were in all this, but I see it as an unhealthy situation for college football, because I just see where there's going to be just too much hyper focus on one conference. And if you don't have meaningful competition, except for Notre Dame and Ohio State and a few schools out there, then how does the sport stay healthy outside of just a small region?
Well, look, the Big Ten's not going to go anywhere. What's going to be interesting is to see the fallout from this. It's all hypothetical at this point. Okay, so a lot of the things that I'm about to lay out here are again entirely hypothetical, and they're wild guesses. But also, kind of going back and now that this information comes out, I kind of go back to what Mark Emmert said last week in regards to maybe they don't need to govern. And I kind of am reading between the lines, but that they don't need to govern college football, saying that not all sports can be governed the same way. I kind of see, a very interesting thing has happened. Notre Dame is always known as wanting a seat at the big boy table and pushing their weight across. The Notre Dame athletic director is on the board that presented the college football playoffs expanded idea, but it comes with the caveat that if you can't get a top 4 seed without winning a conference championship, well, there just happens to not be a conference that Notre Dame's in right now. Did he do that on purpose? That doesn't seem like a Notre Dame thing to go out there and make this kind of deal when you can't put yourself in a bye situation, the best situation to win a national championship. That seems a little fishy to me. And then you get this situation. Do the big time playmakers in college football know something that we didn't know? Is this already in the works? Is Notre Dame already in the works to go to a conference here in 2025? It's just being kept ultra secret. I mean, I don't have tinfoil, but I would tell you right now, I'd get a tinfoil hat and put it on, and this all goes big conspiracy theory. And back to your point, if the ACC picks up Notre Dame, and let's say they go get Oklahoma State or West Virginia, no, it's not Oklahoma and Texas, but that conference strengthens. Of course, let's be honest, if Miami keeps building under Manny Diaz, if Florida State can get back to being the way Florida State is under Mike Norvell, if Matt Brown can keep rolling with North Carolina and turn that program over to somebody, Mac's getting up there in age, so that conference will gain more popularity. So I'm with you on the SEC, but I also think the Big Ten's not going anywhere. James Franklin and Penn State, obviously Ryan Day and Ohio State. We'll see what happens with Michigan. Wisconsin is, they're rolling right along. They're fine. PJ Fleck's up there at Minnesota. And then the Pac-12 will be the baby of the group here. We'll see what happens with them. They'll go out and maybe try and steal a TCU. Maybe they look at Boise State. Maybe they want to bring in Kansas. We'll see. But I think the point being is some of it, you need teams in the other conferences to get better. The ACC could be a really fun conference. If we get Florida State back to where Florida State was and they're battling with Clemson, Miami can rebuild and get back to being Miami. If Bronco Mendenhall can turn Virginia into a quality program, which it looks like he's doing, Dave Doran has had success at NC State. It can happen. It can happen. And so I don't necessarily think that just adding Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC, certainly it'll make it a lot of fun. It'll be must-watch television each and every Saturday. But I don't think it necessarily just becomes the SEC and everybody else.
So somebody asked in the live chat, what happens to the Big 12? Does it dissolve or does it continue and strive and survive first in some way? And my thought there is it depends on how the dominoes fall. Either the Big 12 is going to run out there, and it's now the Big 8, run out there and be able to get somebody back. Boise State, Memphis, Houston, UCF, somebody, preferably 2 to get them back up to 10, and then they kind of solidify and they're okay. But if they don't get them and somebody, let's say the Big 10 grabs an Iowa State and they lose somebody, that's when, if you lose 1 or 2 key members, then it's just going to collapse because schools are going to run scared and they're going to grab the best deal they can find.
My opinion, again, all hypotheticals and all some wild guessing, but reading the tea leaves. Let's start with what we know. The NCAA does not run college football. We learned that last year when the NCAA said, hey, we're not going to play football in the fall. And the FBS said, yes, we are. You go do whatever you want with your FCS league. We'll control ourselves. The college football playoff is not controlled by the NCAA. It's controlled entirely by the college football playoff organization. So that leads us to the next point. NCAA will have no say over this. The college football playoff organization will. And how we get to forming a true governing body, whether there's a commissioner, unfortunately, like the NFL, whether there already is a board of directors, they'll make a decision. And I think this will trickle down to what the Pac-12, the Big Ten, the ACC, and the SEC want to do. Do they want 4 conferences of 16 teams? Is that what it comes down to? Do we do 4 conferences of 16 teams? Do you want 5 conferences of 16 teams? How many teams do you want a part of the new college football federation, or whatever you want to call it? Do you want 5 of 16 or do you want 4 of 16? Because if it's 5, well, the Big 12 is going to be playing from behind, but you hope to keep everybody you got. You hope to keep everybody you got, and then you see who the Big 10 takes, who the Pac-12 takes, and who the ACC takes, and you hope to bring up somebody behind it. Maybe it ends up being Tulane. Maybe it ends up being a Utah State. I don't know, because you're right. Does the Big 10 now go down and try and swoop in and get Iowa State? Does Nebraska see an opening to go back? The realignment here could be a lot of different things. So I think that's what you're looking at is, do the other 4 conferences pick the Big 12 clean now? They just pick them clean. And that's what I just brought up. The ACC now, you would assume it's Notre Dame. And then my personal opinion, if I'm the ACC, you've got 3 schools, maybe 4 schools you can choose from. You can go the lower level route, UCF and Cincinnati, or you can go West Virginia and Oklahoma State. Who do you want to make you at 16? The Big 10 would be in the same position. Let's say you go get Iowa State. Do you want to add Kansas? Do you maybe want to go get Cincinnati? Do you make a push for Cincinnati? Do you want to try and go into the Big 10 market, or excuse me, the Texas market, and take the Big 10 down there and say go get a TCU, maybe a Baylor who academically would fit in the Big 10? And then the Pac-12 will have kind of the last selection there. Do they want to go get Boise State? Again, the Pac-12's obviously got to field a few more teams than the Big 10 and the SEC and the ACC. So I think that's what's going to be interesting is how they elect to play this. And do the major conferences now just want to pick the Big 12 clean if this is what happens?
I think if you do the math, you currently have, I believe it's 64 teams in the 4 conferences, because you got 3 with 14, then you got a team conference with 12, and then with 10. I think it adds up to 64.
65. 65 with Notre Dame, and then throw
Yeah.
BYU in there for 66 if you want to
Okay.
go that.
Yeah. So if we're looking at 4 conferences, if the ultimate goal, and this would be nice to arrive, if we're going to have, I don't want 16 team conferences. I think that's ridiculous and it's too many. But if that's where we're headed, I would like to see some equality in that we've got 4 mega conferences of 16 teams. Well, that adds up to 64. But to extend that to 5 16-team conferences to get to 80, I don't know that there are enough good football playing schools to get us to 80.
Well,
Might
again,
be
well,
difficult.
we just got to 66, and if you've got 14 that are willing to financially make the jump and invest the resource, because this is going to be big boy football at its finest.
Mhm.
This is a small step away from the NFL, but do you have 14? You and I can kind of go through them real quick. Central Florida, Houston, Cincinnati, Memphis. That takes you to 70. Throw Boise State in there. Now we're at 71. Is Tulane, South Florida. We're at 73.
San Diego State,
You see what I'm saying?
somebody like that.
You're right. You're going to push the envelope here. Nevada would be another one. Maybe they're ready to make it. I don't know. You can push the envelope certainly, and not to make it sound bad. We're scraping the bottom, not the bottom of the barrel. We're not going. But you get the point. Appalachian
Yeah.
State's another one. Appalachian State's a program close to me that has had a lot of success. Coastal Carolina down the road from me, 2.5 hours, is doing everything they can to try and build up their program, to build up their stadium, their fan base. East Carolina, that's a great one. So we can all name them that, yes, we can get to 80. We can get to 80, but that last conference, that 5th conference is going to be the runt of the group if it plays out like I think it will.
Yeah, you get those military academies into one, I guess. I had a different vision for all of this years ago, but it's obviously not going to take shape. I had 12 teams in 6 conferences, and I put all the military academies, at least Army and Navy, into one. But it is pretty fascinating to see it all play out. Well, Will, is there anything going on in regards to what you caught at SEC Media Days? I know that this is the talk of college football, but I still heard some scattered thoughts the last couple of days from Nick Saban, Jimbo Fisher, and others that Eli Drinkwitz, if nobody knows, this guy is worth listening to, for one thing.
Yeah, Drinkwitz was.
He's funny.
I'll admit, because obviously Drinkwitz would have been the first year last year for him, and so I'll admit I have not heard much of him, like listened to him much. And so I was actually fascinated to hear him this morning. I don't know his relationship with South Carolina. Let me be perfectly clear about that. I have no clue what his relationship with South Carolina is. What I do know is that he seemed to enjoy poking fun at South Carolina the last 3 years. He beat South Carolina when he was the head coach at Appalachian State, and kind of made some comments about that after the game. Last year, after Missouri beat South Carolina, he proceeded to kind of talk about how he came in with a depleted roster and was still able to win the game, even though South Carolina was like right there at the limit of 53. I think they were both playing with 53-man rosters. It was basically an even game that they won by a touchdown in terms of guys on the roster. And then this morning, before he goes on the podium, I almost just sent a text message to Shane Beamer just to say, hey, are you guys friends? Or, is there, because he made some comments about Beamer on Monday, and I was just curious. I listened to Drinkwitz as he did his rounds, both, on the set with the SEC Network. I got a TV behind me. I keep pointing back here. As he did his rounds, and then as he spoke at the podium, and he finally said what I was starting to think. I was like, this guy's very Steve Spurrier-ish. And he finally admitted that he has an affinity. It's where he wears the visor, that he really appreciated how Spurrier coached, and I think how he handled everything. So I finally was able to put that one together. But man, that's an interesting guy. And I'll be honest, if he continues to have success, that's one guy that I'm looking at is maybe the next big time coach in this country. How long can Missouri keep him? He's got a very good. I like this comment today. They were going for the first time ever to have one player win freshman player of the year back-to-back years, and Connor Bazelak, the quarterback there, since he was a freshman last year, and technically I guess he's a freshman again since the year didn't count. But man, if he goes out there and has a good year and is able to maybe pull one of these upsets, get to second in the East, and you look around, if you're a Michigan, if you're somebody out there who's having a big time program, I could think of a lot worse than him. I'm impressed with him. I'm not sure I like him, but I'm impressed with him.
Yeah, and then I saw Jimbo Fisher yesterday, and of course he had to answer all the questions about Alabama, and he took his shot at the Tide, which of course he has spun into a comment of respect that they're the dog, they're the big dog, the alpha dog, they're the one that set the standard, and we're just going after them. So it's a compliment to them that we're taking a shot at them. Nick Saban didn't have the state of address type speech that he typically has, where he likes to zero in on whatever is concerning him about not just the SEC, but college football, and kind of be the spokesman for the sport to say, we need to fix this or change this, or I'm concerned about that. He brought up NIL and thought he was very forthright. Had kind of the same response I had for a lot of people that asked me so many questions, like they're asking you to say, we don't know. We just don't know how a lot of this is going to look and play out, and what some of the issues are going to be 6 months from now.
No, I was a very strange, having listened to Nick several times and been in the room there, and then watching some of his press conferences just online or whatever. It was a kind of a strange visit for him. I don't know if you caught again after his podium, he went to the SEC Network set, and they asked him about the expanded playoff. I was actually surprised that nobody brought that up. That was one of the reasons I was really watching his press conference yesterday, was to hear his comments on the expanded playoff, especially a day after Dabo Swinney had really said he didn't like the idea of the expanded playoff. So I was very fascinated. And you get Nick Saban on the SEC Network podium, I think with Laura Rutledge up there or Alyssa Lang, and his answer was no, he's not crazy about it. And one of the reasons he cited was the weirdest one I've ever heard. He said, well, what if we have to go play Wisconsin in December in Madison?
I heard that.
Okay, that's football. That's part of college football. And he was like, well, and I couldn't understand, but he said something about when he was in the pros and they went up to play Buffalo in December and they couldn't get players to go out, and I'm thinking that's your reasoning? Like, that's the.
Yeah, I heard that too.
You of all people are worried about not having to go to.
I had the same reaction. A guy that's all about toughness, and we're football players, and
I was just it for Nick Saban, and I don't believe this to be the case. I just give him the benefit of the doubt. It seemed very unprepared. It seems like he's taken aback. I went to lunch with some friends today, and we were kind of talking about it. And man, the last 45 days of college football that hadn't involved a game, you've had the expanded playoff, you've had the name, image, likeness go into effect, and now you've got this potential bombshell of Oklahoma, Texas. We'll see where it goes. But if you asked me today, July 22nd, at 3:56 Eastern time, college football as we know it is over. And maybe enjoy this year, but college football as we know it is over. I'm 39 years old. My generation's college football is done. The younger crowd, this will be what you grow up watching and what you're accustomed to now. It's going to be an entirely different. I think it's going to be an enjoyable sport, but what we've known from it, from going back to the BCS to now the college football playoff, everything's about to be completely redone.
The product on the field is not going to suffer. There's still going to be amazing athletes coached by amazing coaches, and amazing games are going to result. There's no question about that. But if I'm reading you in the same way that I'm grieving, in a sense, this situation, this is why college football is not going to be what it's been in the past. To me, what separates college athletics and to me college football, because I care about it more than the other sports, is that when I say Big Ten football to you, or SEC, or Pac-12, not just right this second, but going back decades to what you've experienced in watching it, there's a different feel to each conference. There's a different, because it comes from a different area of the country. And all we have to do is look around our great country, our great land, and see that people like different kinds of music and dress a little differently, and there are different weather patterns and different cultures and different vibes. And those were always reflected with different flavor in each conference. And that's been disrupted largely by what is the commonality between Nebraska and Rutgers just outside New York City? Well, they're almost more than a half a country separated, or West Virginia and the rest of the Big 12, and on and on. So it's already been torn apart to a certain extent, but this seems to be just even and not just Oklahoma, Texas don't fit in the SEC so much, but it's everything that's going to result from that. That's going to be a further just ripping apart of the culture of these conferences and the flavor and the character that go along with it.
Yeah,
I don't like that.
You know, I did studies on this. I went through a divorce several years ago, and just doing psychological things, reading. I think it's something like 83 or 84% of humans, and I can't remember the exact wording of the article I read, but handle change, just overall change. Whether it's learning to, the simple change of when I started doing a morning show from being able to sleep till 8 a.m. to having to get up at 5:30 to do a morning show. It can be something as simple as that. It can be something as big as with the first time you ever have a child and you have to learn to take care of it. And college football for a lot of us is a passion. People that are watching this, it's a passion, and it's something that we can use is a release on Saturdays or a release in the spring to follow your recruits or to get into spring practice, and everything's about to change. And about 83 or 84% of us are not going to like this. It doesn't matter what's happening. We're just not going to like change. I do have the belief that college football is going to be perfectly fine. But what you're going to get is less of maybe the little guy. We're going to see less of the Coastal Carolina, the Akron. What are they going to do? I mean, that's going to the teams that do we go to 4 mega conferences, but we keep the MAC and the Mountain West and the Sun Belt. They get to be around. Do they get to still hang out, or do they have to go form their own division of football? Now that there is a big change. The games are still going to be great. Look, college football was evolving in front of our eyes. Kids were opting out of bowl games. There was becoming less and less parity. We can sit here today, and I can almost I could try to make a wager with a lot of people that I don't really care to make, but I can sit here today and probably say, look, Alabama, Clemson, they're in the college football playoff. We haven't even hit fall camp, and I'm willing to bet my life savings that Alabama and Clemson are in that college football playoff. And then to me, it's going to be one of Ohio State, Oklahoma, or Georgia to round out the third, and then probably some random team that, a Michigan State, a Washington, Notre Dame's been in there twice. My point is, there's not a lot of parity in college football right now. There's about 120 teams, 115 teams that start the season pretty much with no chance of making the college football playoff. So the expanded playoff is good. There's a lot of things that make it good, but we're all going to have to adapt to the change and continue to like the sport that we've all grown up on and continue to use in the falls to get us through.
And finally, Will, even though that was a great way to end it, I've got to get your take on if you heard from Mike Leach, because I was fascinated to hear from him at the podium. And speaking of a college football playoff, of course, his solution to the whole thing is 64 teams. Now, I don't know that he's ever laid out exactly how that's supposed to work, but 64 teams, and he stands there and says that over and over, and he looks to be dead serious.
What is that? I should know. What is that? That's 63 games. Is that right? 65
yes.
games?
It's just like the NCAA basketball tournament, or what it used to be. Yeah.
Well, there's 52 weeks in the year, so you tell me how that works. I understand. That's Mike Leach to me being kooky and crazy, but you're right. I mean, what you're gonna have? You're gonna have a team play on Thursday and then play again on Sunday. I mean, God, I understand where he's going with that, but obviously there's no way that would work at all. So I think that's just Mike Leach doing Mike Leach things, because again, if you're going to play every Saturday, what do we just do? 65 games, and there's only 52 weeks in the year.
Yeah, you play a 4-game regular season, I guess. But yeah, that's just, well, and that comes from a guy that's been the head coach at Washington State, Mississippi State, and Texas Tech.
Yeah.
I pretty much need 64 teams to get in for me to make it. So yeah, good stuff, Will.
Always appreciate. Glad we got the computer worked out.
Absolutely.
Certainly, we head into fun times. Should be a nice little weekend. It'll be interesting to see where this Oklahoma Texas stuff kind of goes and how this evolves. The one thing I'll go back to that real quick that I find fascinating is if this does come to fruition. It felt like a lot of things were aimed at 2025. This is not a good way for the Big 12. It's not going to bother me, and it's not going to bother anybody in the Big 10 or the ACC. But if this lingers on and we don't get an answer, and this is what's happening with Oklahoma and Texas in September and October, November, not a good year for the Big 12. And it won't be probably regardless. But I guess my point in that is you can't have those two programs. If it's announced, let's hypothetically say mid-August that they're going to the SEC. If that's what's announced, this has got to be their last year, right? I mean, you can't have them play 3 more years in the Big 12 before everything shifts in 2025.
Yeah, how does the Big 12 continue to brand and market itself and talk about the future without its 2 best programs? By far, it's not even close. Its 2 biggest programs moving on, and everybody knows it, and just have smiles and hype up the league and talk about how great a season it's going to be. How do you do that?
It'll be my opinion, and if this is true, if it's not some ploy by Texas and Oklahoma to do whatever. But you mentioned it, you brought it up, and that's the big thing. Financially, there's nothing I can see the Big 12 doing to catch up to the Big 10 or the SEC in terms of revenue. It's going to be hard for them. I believe I read this correctly. Fox just passed on early negotiations for the Big 12 television rights. There's nothing that the Big 12 can do right now to financially compete. And I think this is Oklahoma and Texas looking at it, and they realize the first shot, let's go to the SEC. Let's see if we can get in there. And I feel like if the SEC, if those schools do vote and do not vote, then we were kind of talking about this. And I don't know if you heard me when I was breaking up earlier. I see a scenario here where if Greg Sankey's worked behind the scenes to make this work, that's fine. Missouri and Texas A&M can vote no. But I can see Greg Sankey coming to the other 12 members and going, I did this. If you want to vote no, go find another conference. We'll find somebody. Don't worry, we can find somebody to replace you. This is what we're doing because this is the direction of college football. I don't see him giving the ACC, who I think Oklahoma and Texas would go to next, because if the ACC could get Oklahoma and Texas, man, you talk about that building the ACC to where they can now command the type of money the SEC and the Big Ten are doing. The ACC would love to do that, I would imagine. They'd look at Notre Dame and say, you had all the opportunity in the world to join us, and you never did. We let you play a free year in the conference. We're going to take those 2, and we're going to really increase our brand. So the SEC, I think, is making the movement early, and you see why Texas and Oklahoma are doing it. We'll see how it plays out.
Fascinating times. Will Gunter, 107.5 The Game, the all-new early game is his show. Will, we always appreciate the conversation, always learn a lot and enjoy it.
Glad we got the computer fixed. Look forward to doing it again.
All right, folks. Appreciate everybody being here. We had about 50 or 60 on the line. And again, an impromptu reaction live stream on what's going on with the Big 12 and the SEC. And we will continue to come on live and produce videos responding to more information as this plays out. And we're not going to ignore the rest of college football. I've got my predictions coming out. We've already released about 5 or 6 teams. We've got the rest of the Power 5 to release over on the main channel, not here on the SEC channel, but on the main channel. I'm releasing a prediction video for all the teams. And so much more than that. We've got roster breakdowns that have come out on Clemson, Texas A&M, Alabama, Ole Miss, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, Clemson, Florida State, and more. So keep it locked in here at the Voice of College Football. We appreciate everybody being here, and we will see all of you next time.